My name is Alex, or rather, that is what most people in Cedar Creek knew me as before everything changed. Coming back here, after nearly a decade away, felt like stepping into a faded photograph. The air still carried that distinct scent of pine and damp earth, a smell that always promised both comfort and a hint of something ancient, something deeply rooted. I had left Cedar Creek chasing bigger dreams, the kind that glittered under city lights, but a persistent, almost nagging feeling had tugged me back. My grandmother, bless her stubborn heart, had passed, leaving behind not just her old house on Elm Street, but also a collection of cryptic journals and a sense of unfinished business that hummed beneath the town's placid surface. Cedar Creek always prided itself on its quiet charm. It was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone, where the high school football team was the talk of the town, and where the biggest scandal usually involved a misplaced garden gnome. Or so I thought. My initial return was a pilgrimage of sorts, a way to sort through memories and belongings. But as I unpacked boxes filled with my grandmother's life, I started noticing things. Small details at first, like the way folks would suddenly change the subject when I mentioned the old lumber mill, or the nervous glances exchanged when I asked about the town's dwindling fishing industry. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but it was there, like a faint tremor beneath solid ground. My grandmother, Elara, was a creature of habit and fierce curiosity. She was the unofficial archivist of Cedar Creek, a woman who believed every story held a piece of truth, whether people wanted to hear it or not. Her journals, filled with elegant, cursive, and pressed wildflowers, were less about personal anecdotes and more about the town's history, its economy, its curious characters. After a few weeks of sifting through them, I realized they weren't just memories. They were a meticulously compiled record, a silent testament to something unsettling. She had documented strange property dealings, unexplained absences, and a series of seemingly unrelated incidents that, when viewed together, began to form a disturbing pattern. One entry, dated almost 15 years ago, caught my eye. It spoke of a sudden, drastic change in the town's water quality, quickly dismissed by local authorities as a temporary anomaly. Yet, she had meticulously noted local illnesses, livestock deaths, and even the wilting of specific plant species around Miller's Creek, the very creek that fed into our town's reservoir. Her handwriting became more urgent, almost frantic, as she described her attempts to raise concerns, only to be met with polite dismissals and then outright hostility. She wrote that certain powerful individuals had effectively silenced her, making her feel like an old woman peddling conspiracy theories. I remembered her frustration, her quiet fury, but as a teenager I had brushed it off as grandmotherly eccentricity. Now, reading her words, I felt a cold dread begin to seep into my bones. The lumber mill, once the town's lifeblood, had closed down abruptly 5 years ago, leaving hundreds jobless. The official story was economic hardship, declining demand. But Ilara's journals hinted at something else, a rushed sale to an out-of-town conglomerate at a suspiciously low price, followed by an immediate demolition of the old structures, almost as if to erase its very existence. The land, fertile and sprawling, had remained untouched ever since, a silent, overgrown testament to a lost era. People whispered about it, of course, but no one dared speak too loudly. It was a wound the town had learned to live with, like a phantom limb. My first real step into this hidden world came when I visited the town archives, ostensibly to find old photographs for a family album. Mrs. Gable, the librarian, a woman whose face was a road map of Cedar Creek's history, greeted me with a knowing smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. She was an old friend of my grandmother's, a kindred spirit in quiet observation. When I mentioned Ilara's interest in the mill, Mrs. Gable's smile faltered. She leaned in conspiratorially, lowering her voice. She told me that Ilara had been quite insistent about certain records, especially those pertaining to the mill's final years and the water reports from the mid-2000s. She said those files, along with several others, had mysteriously gone missing from the archives just a few months before Ilara passed. Gone, she emphasized, without a trace, no record of their retrieval or destruction. That conversation was a turning point. It wasn't just my grandmother's imagination anymore. Someone had actively tried to bury information. The idea that Cedar Creek, my sleepy, innocent hometown, harbored such a secret, such a deliberate act of concealment, was jarring. It was like discovering a hidden, festering wound beneath a perfectly starched linen tablecloth. I started looking at everything differently, seeing the cracks in the facade. The immaculate town square, the freshly painted storefronts, the polite, almost too friendly smiles of the town council members. It all began to feel like a carefully constructed stage set. I knew I couldn't do this alone. My grandmother's journals were a map, but I needed a guide, or at least a few fellow travelers. My first thought was Sam Miller. Sam was a few years older than me, a childhood friend who had never left Cedar Creek. He ran the local hardware store, a place where gossip flowed as freely as coffee. Sam was gruff, pragmatic, and possessed an encyclopedic knowledge of everyone and everything in town. More importantly, he had a deep, almost fierce loyalty to Cedar Creek, despite his constant complaints about its slow pace. He also had a history of being quietly rebellious, a trait I knew Ilara had always admired. I found Sam behind the counter, meticulously organizing a display of garden tools. He looked up, his eyes crinkling at the corners. He said it was good to see me. Sky in bruised purples and oranges. We gathered our gear. Flashlights, a crowbar, a digital camera, and a small, discreet satchel for documents. Ilara, despite her nervousness, had an air of grim determination. Silas, surprisingly agile for his age, led the way, his eyes scanning the shadows, his senses alert. The old town hall stood like a silent sentinel, its windows dark, its brick facade crumbling in places. We approached from the rear, slipping through a gap in a rusted chain-link fence. The air was cold, carrying the faint, metallic scent of the creek. A shiver ran down my spine, not just from the chill, but from the sense of foreboding that clung to the building like a shroud. Silas pointed to a heavy, wooden door, almost completely obscured by overgrown ivy. This is it. He tried the handle. Locked. He produced a set of old, rusty keys from his pocket. These are from when I worked here. Might still fit. He fumbled with the keys, his hands shaking slightly. The lock clicked. A loud, echoing sound in the stillness of the evening. We pushed the door open, revealing a dark, musty passage that led downwards into the earth. The air that greeted us was thick, with the smell of damp concrete, decaying paper, and something else, something vaguely metallic and earthy, like old blood and rust. We descended into the basement, our flashlights cutting through the oppressive darkness. The space was enormous, a warren of forgotten rooms and narrow corridors, lined with shelves overflowing with boxes, old furniture, and cobweb-draped machinery. Dust motes danced in the beams of our lights, giving the air a shimmering, ethereal quality. Silas navigated the maze with surprising ease, leading us deeper and deeper until we reached a section filled with metal filing cabinets and stacks of bound ledgers. "This is where they kept the old property records," he whispered, "before the new annex was built." We began to search, our movements cautious, our voices low. The silence of the basement was unnerving, broken only by the rustle of paper and the occasional creak of the old building settling. Time seemed to stretch and warp in the subterranean gloom. Hours passed. We uncovered reams of mundane municipal data, tax records, building permits, zoning ordinances. But then, Ilara found something. A series of thick, leather-bound journals, labeled Mill Operations Cedar Creek, 1948 to 1962. Her fingers trembled as she pulled the first one from the shelf. Inside, meticulously handwritten entries detailed the mill's early days, its expansion, its production quotas. And then, buried within the dry statistics, we found it. early environmental impact assessments conducted by an independent firm detailing significant concerns about the discharge of industrial waste into the creek, recommendations for stricter filtration systems for proper waste disposal, and then a series of subsequent entries signed by local officials dismissing these concerns, deeming them economically unfeasible. It was all there. The original warnings, the deliberate disregard, the prioritization of profit over public health. The initial assessments were damning, predicting exactly the kind of widespread contamination Alara had now confirmed. It wasn't just negligence. It was a conscious decision to poison the land and its people. As we continued to pore over the documents, Silas let out a gasp. He had found another set of files, tucked away in a locked cabinet. These were different, bound in plain brown paper, with no official labels. He used the crowbar to leverage the crowbar, the old metal groaning under the strain. A sharp crack echoed in the otherwise silent room, and the flimsy lock on the cabinet door splintered, showering tiny fragments of wood and rust onto the dusty floor. The door swung open with a reluctant squeal, revealing not neatly stacked folders or official binders, but a haphazard pile of plain brown paper bundles. They looked ancient, untouched for decades, their edges softened by time, their surfaces discolored by damp and neglect. Silas reached in, his hand trembling slightly, and pulled out the topmost bundle. It was tied with fraying twine, which he carefully untangled before spreading the contents onto the desk alongside the other documents. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic drumbeat in the oppressive silence. These weren't corporate reports or environmental assessments. These were personal. Handwritten notes, faded carbon copies of letters, ledger pages filled with precise, almost elegant script. The first document Silas laid out was a yellowed, brittle sheet of paper, folded precisely in thirds. It was a letter, penned in an elegant, looping script that spoke of a bygone era. The ink, once black, had faded to a sepia tone, almost indistinguishable from the paper itself in places. The date at the top, barely legible, read October 12, 1908. My breath hitched. This was not just old, it was ancient, predating even the most optimistic estimates of the estate's decay. The letter was addressed to a Mr. Alistair Finch from a Mrs. Eleanor Vance. Silas's brow furrowed as he began to read aloud, his voice hushed, almost reverent, as if afraid to disturb the ghosts of the words. My dearest Alistair, I write this with a heart heavy with sorrow, and a mind consumed by doubt. The fever has taken hold of little Thomas, and the local physician, bless his kind but limited soul, can offer no remedies beyond prayers. His skin is hot to the touch, his breathing shallow, and his eyes, usually so full of mischief, are now clouded with pain. The cough rattles his small frame ceaselessly. I fear for him, Alistair, more than I can express in these paltry words. The very air of this place seems to suffocate us, a damp chill that penetrates to the bone even in the height of summer. My dreams are plagued by the whispers of the marsh, a constant, insidious murmur that seems to call to him, to all of us. You spoke of a solution, a desperate measure, one that goes against all I have been taught. You spoke of the old ways, of the earth's forgotten secrets, of a chance, however slim, to turn the tide. My dear husband, I am at the end of my rope. My child is fading before my eyes. Tell me again of this hope, of this ancient wisdom. Tell me it is not merely the ravings of a man consumed by grief. I will meet you by the old willow tree at dusk, as we discussed. I will bring what little I have left of my courage. Yours in despair, Eleanor. Silas finished reading, the last word hanging in the air like a lament. He looked up, his eyes meeting mine, wide with a shared understanding that what we had stumbled upon was far more profound than mere corporate negligence. This was personal tragedy, steeped in desperation and a hint of the occult, or at least the superstitious. Alistair Finch. Eleanor Vance. Thomas. These names, once abstract echoes in the estate's history, were now beginning to take shape, imbued with the raw emotion of the letter. The fever, the cough, the marshes' whispers. It all clicked into place with the environmental reports we had dismissed. The sickness, the land's decay. It wasn't just a recent phenomenon. It had roots, deep and tangled, reaching back over a century. This old willow tree, I mused aloud. Is it still standing? Silas shook his head slowly. I don't know. This estate is vast. But the mention of the fever, the damp chill, the marsh, it's all here. It connects. He pointed to the documents we had already found. The early reports of a peculiar illness affecting the workers, the strange plant growth, the soil samples. They weren't just isolated incidents. They were part of a long, unfolding narrative. He reached for another bundle, his movements more deliberate now, his previous impatience replaced by a focused intensity. He untied the twine, the knot giving way with a dry snap, and laid out a series of smaller, more delicate papers. These were not letters, but what looked like entries from a journal, written in the same elegant hand as Eleanor Vance's letter, though the script was now more erratic, almost frantic in places. He began to read again, his voice lower this time, as if sharing a secret with the silence of the room. November 3rd, 1908. The ritual was performed. Alistair, in his desperate wisdom, followed the old woman's instructions precisely. We brought Thomas to the heart of the marsh, where the air hangs thick and still, where the ancient roots of the cypress trees twist like tortured limbs. The moon was a sliver, barely illuminating the murky water. The old woman, her face a road map of wrinkles, chanted in a tongue I did not understand, her voice a low drone that seemed to pull at the very fabric of the night. She mixed the herbs, the roots, the mud from the deepest part of the bog, and applied it to Thomas's chest. His fever, for a moment, seemed to abate, a flicker of hope. November 7th, 1908. Thomas is weaker. The fever has returned with a vengeance. His cough is a ragged, tearing sound. Alistair is distraught, blaming himself. But what choice did we have? The physician was useless. The old woman promised. She promised. I saw something in the marsh that night, a brief, fleeting shadow, a disturbance in the water that was not the wind. It felt watchful. November 10th, 1908. He is gone. My little Thomas, my sweet boy. His last breath was a shallow sigh. The silence in the house is deafening. Alistair is broken. He sits by the window, staring out at the marsh, his eyes vacant. He speaks of a debt, a price paid. What debt? What price? The old woman vanished the morning after the ritual. I hear whispers in the servants' quarters, talk of a curse, of the land exacting its due. I do not understand. November 15th, 1908. Alistair has changed. He walks the grounds at night, a restless shadow. He mutters to himself, words I cannot decipher, words that sound like the old woman's chants. He says the land demands more. More than Thomas? My heart shivers with a cold dread that has nothing to do with the winter air. He has started to dig. In the marsh, I see him from my window, a solitary figure under the pale moon, turning the earth. What is he burying? Or what is he seeking? The entries stopped abruptly there. The journal was incomplete, or perhaps the rest was lost. The implications were chilling. A desperate father, a mysterious ritual, the death of a child, and then the father's descent into madness. Digging in the marsh. It painted a picture of a family consumed by grief, and a dark, ancient power lurking beneath the seemingly placid surface of the estate. Silas leaned back, rubbing his temples. This is not what I expected. Not even close. Nor I replied, my voice barely a whisper. It's horrific. A child. And the father, he went mad. He picked up the last entry again, tracing the faded script with a finger. The land demands more. What could that mean? And what was he digging for? Or burying? He reached for another bundle. This one, thicker, heavier. As he untied it, a faint earthy smell, like damp soil and decaying leaves, seemed to emanate from the papers. This bundle contained a collection of loose ledger pages, bound together with a piece of string. The script was different this time, bolder, more angular, clearly a different hand. The date spanned several years, from 1909 to 1915. These appeared to be Alistair Finch's own writings. They were not journal entries in the traditional sense, but a meticulous, almost obsessive record of observations. Each page was filled with columns, date, time, location, often specific coordinates within the marsh, observation, and a final column titled Notes. Silas began to read the observations column, skipping over the precise dates and times for now, focusing on the content. Peculiar luminosity observed in the marsh grasses at twilight. Strange guttural sounds emanating from the deeper pools, not identifiable as local wildlife. Rapid decomposition of organic matter in specific areas, far exceeding natural rate. Unusual growth patterns in the reeds, forming intricate, unsettling geometries. The water in the central bog is a deeper, unnatural black. No reflection. Small animal carcasses discovered, intact but drained of all fluids. The air feels heavier near the ancient cypress. A tangible pressure. Dreams of a presence beneath the soil, a slow, patient hunger. The whispers are clearer now. They speak of sustenance, of awakening. My own blood feels thin, my strength waning, yet a strange clarity descends when I am near the bog. The sacrifice, it was not enough. It merely stirred it. It demands more. The trees are listening. The earth is breathing. Silas stopped, his face pale. He looked at me, his eyes wide with a dawning horror. This isn't a man going mad. This is a man documenting something truly unnatural, a living entity, perhaps, something that feeds. My stomach churned. The chill in the room was no longer merely from the lack of heat. It was a visceral cold, seeping into my bones. The environmental reports, the strange plant mutations, the inexplicable animal deaths, they weren't just anomalies. They were evidence meticulously recorded by a man who had stumbled into a nightmare. This Alistair Finch, he wasn't just grieving. He was becoming an unwilling chronicler of something ancient and terrible. And the sickness, the blight affecting the land, the workers, even our own experience in the house, it wasn't just pollution. It was a symptom. Silas turned to the final column, the notes. His voice was barely audible as he read the last entry on the final page, dated March 14, 1915. The whispers guide my hand. I understand now. The cycle must continue. The land demands its due, and I, Alistair Finch, am its humble servant. The awakening is near. The seeds are sown. The harvest will come. The page ended there. No signature, no farewell. Just that chilling, cryptic message. The harvest will come. We sat in silence for a long moment. The only sound, the frantic thudding of my own heart against my ribs. The weight of what we had uncovered was immense, crushing. It was a story of a family's despair leading to a pact with something malevolent, something that had been slumbering beneath the estate for over a century, slowly awakening, slowly demanding its due. This is why the land is sick, I finally managed to croak out. This is why nothing grows. This is why the workers are ill. It's not just chemicals, it's something else, something living. Silas nodded, his gaze fixed on the ledger pages, and the company, he trailed off. Were they aware? Did they know what they were buying into? Or did they just see the land, ripe for exploitation, and ignore the deeper, darker truth? He started to go through the remaining bundles, but with a new urgency, a new understanding. The documents that followed were a mix of legal papers, property deeds, and more personal correspondence, but now, Everything was filtered through the lens of Alistair Finch's chilling observations. There were records of the Finch family's gradual decline. Eleanor Vance, Alistair's wife, was committed to an asylum in 1916, suffering from severe melancholia and delusions of being watched by the marsh. Her death certificate, dated 1920, listed the cause as heart failure, but the underlying narrative suggested a spirit broken by terror and grief. Alistair Finch himself disappeared in late 1915. There was no official record of his death, only a missing persons report filed by a distant relative, mentioning his increasingly erratic behavior and obsession with the marsh. He was presumed lost to the bog, a common enough fate in those parts, but after reading his notes, I felt a colder, more sinister explanation clawing at the edges of my mind. He hadn't just gotten lost, he had become part of the cycle, the harvest. Then came the documents relating to the subsequent owners of the estate. A series of short-lived tenures, each one ending in financial ruin, mysterious illnesses, or sudden, unexplained departures. The land, it seemed, was cursed, or rather, it was demanding its tribute. One particular document caught Silas's eye. It was a faded newspaper clipping from 1934, detailing the strange disappearance of a farmhand on the estate. The article mentioned bizarre soil conditions and a local superstition about the land being hungry. The authorities had dismissed it as a tragic accident, but the subtext, now clear to us, spoke of a pattern. The final bundle contained documents from the mid-20th century, culminating in the acquisition of the estate by the very corporation Silas was investigating. These were the corporate reports, the environmental assessments, the soil samples, but now they read differently. The anomalous readings, the strange plant mutations, the inexplicable sickness among the initial survey teams, they weren't just data points. They were echoes of Alistair Finch's ledger, modern scientific observations inadvertently confirming an ancient horror. The corporate reports mentioned extensive efforts to drain parts of the marsh, to make the land arable, to build the planned industrial complex. They detailed failures, equipment malfunctions, and a surprisingly high turnover rate among the workers assigned to the marshland reclamation projects. The language was sterile, objective, but between the lines, I could almost hear the frustrated sighs of engineers and the nervous whispers of foremen. One report, dated 1972, stood out. It was a confidential internal memo from a senior environmental consultant to the CEO of the corporation. The consultant, a Dr. Evelyn Reed, expressed grave concerns about the unusual biological activity observed in the marsh. She described a unique, aggressive form of fungal growth that seemed to resist all known fungicides, and a Prutskazi paturi, peculiar phenomenon where the marsh seemed to actively resist drainage efforts, almost as if it were a living, conscious entity. She even hinted at anecdotal evidence of workers experiencing vivid, disturbing nightmares and a pervasive sense of dread while working in the affected areas. Her recommendation was stark: cease all development on the marshland, cordon it off, and conduct a thorough, long-term ecological study. She warned of potential unknown health hazards and ecological catastrophe if the marsh's unique ecosystem was further disturbed. The memo had a handwritten note scrawled across the top in red ink. Dismissed. Cost prohibitive. Proceed with original plans. Signed with an illegible flourish, presumably the CEO. Silas let out a slow, heavy breath. They knew. Or at least, they were warned. Dr. Reed understood something was deeply wrong here, and they ignored it. They chose profit over everything, but they didn't understand the why. I interjected. They saw anomalous biological activity. We've seen the history. We've seen Alistair Finch's descent. It's not just a fungus. It's a force. Something that demands sustenance. The phrase, the harvest, will come echoed in my mind. What was the harvest? The land was not producing crops. It was consuming. Silas began to re-examine the early environmental assessments, the ones that had first drawn him to the estate. He pointed to a section detailing the soil composition. Anomalous organic matter, unusually high concentrations of certain trace elements, and a peculiar microbial signature that defied classification. It was all there, laid out in scientific jargon, confirming the insidious presence that Alistair Finch had documented in his desperate, mad scribblings. He then pulled out a more recent document, a preliminary report from our own current investigation. It detailed the unusual illnesses affecting the local population, the strange, aggressive plant growth in the abandoned fields, the high rate of livestock mortality. The symptoms described in the modern medical reports mirrored those of little Thomas Vance: fever, cough, respiratory distress, and a profound, debilitating lethargy. "It's still happening," I whispered, my voice thick with dread. "The cycle. It never stopped. The land is still hungry. And the corporation, by disturbing it, by trying to drain it, by bringing in more people, they just fed it. They accelerated the harvest." The room grew colder, the shadows lengthening, as the last vestiges of daylight surrendered to the encroaching dusk. The wind outside picked up, rattling the loose panes of glass in the window, sounding like a mournful sigh. The house itself seemed to groan under the weight of its secrets. Silas began to organize the documents, not for filing, but for a coherent narrative. The letters from Eleanor, Alistair's journal and ledgers, the newspaper clippings, the property deeds, Eleanor's asylum records, the corporate memos, Dr. Reed's warnings, and finally, our own preliminary findings. It was a century-long story of a silent, malevolent entity slowly consuming the land and its inhabitants. "This isn't just a lawsuit," Silas said, his voice grim. "This is a warning. We have to get this out. All of it." "But who would believe us?" I asked, the doubt a cold knot in my stomach. "A century-old curse? A sentient marsh? They'll say we've gone mad, just like Eleanor." He looked at me, his eyes resolute. "We have the evidence. The scientific data, historical records, and personal accounts. It paints a picture, a terrifying one, yes, but a consistent one. The corporation's negligence isn't just about polluting the environment. It's about disturbing something ancient and terrible, something that has been festering here for generations." He packed the documents carefully into his satchel, his movements precise and deliberate. "We cannot leave them here. Not now." As he closed the satchel, a small, loose piece of paper, previously unnoticed, fluttered to the floor from the bottom of one of the bundles. It was a child's drawing, crudely sketched with a piece of charcoal on rough paper. It depicted a stick figure, small and fragile, standing by a towering, gnarled tree. Below the stick figure, a series of wavy lines represented water. But the most disturbing detail was the tree itself. Its roots, instead of going into the ground, seemed to be reaching up like grasping fingers towards the child. And in the murky water, two glowing eyes peered out from the darkness. It was signed, in a childish scrawl, Thomas. My breath caught in my throat. This wasn't Alistair's sophisticated script, nor Eleanor's elegant hand. This was Thomas's drawing. Drawn by the child who had died of the fever. The child whose death had set this horrifying chain of events in motion. He had seen it. He had seen the presence in the marsh. Silas picked up the drawing, his face a mask of profound sorrow. He saw it. He understood what was happening. And he was just a child. The implications were devastating. Thomas hadn't just succumbed to an ordinary fever. He had been a victim, perhaps even the first modern offering, to whatever entity resided in the marsh. His death wasn't just a tragedy, it was the catalyst, the spark that ignited Alistair's desperate pact and, ultimately, the awakening of the land's hunger. We had found not just a story, but a terrible truth, a living, breathing, hungry truth that had claimed one child and was poised to claim another. The air in the study, once merely heavy with dust and forgotten memories, now pressed in on me with the weight of impending doom. It was no longer just the musty smell of old paper. It was the stench of decay, of desperation, of something ancient and malevolent, stirring beneath the very foundations of this house. Silas, still clutching Thomas's drawing, looked up at me. His eyes, usually so vibrant with a child's curiosity, were now shadowed, holding an understanding far too profound for his years. He was not just a boy who drew pictures. He was a witness, a victim in waiting, perhaps even an unwilling participant in the unfolding horror. He knew. He had known all along. The quietness, the stillness, the way he sometimes gazed out towards the marsh with an unnerving intensity. It was not childish imagination. It was the quiet resignation of one who has seen the monster, stared into its abyss, and perhaps even made a terrible peace with its existence. I knelt before him, my knees protesting on the cold, hard floorboards. The drawing of the mangled toy boat and the shadowy figure was still clutched in his small hand, a silent accusation. My voice, when it came, was a ragged whisper, barely audible above the rhythmic creaks of the old house settling, or, perhaps, breathing. "Silas," I began, my throat tight. "What is this? What have you seen?" He did not flinch, did not shy away. His gaze remained locked on mine, unwavering. It was unnerving. Most children would have burst into tears, sought comfort, or cowered. Not Silas. He was a small, stoic sentinel guarding a terrible secret. He slowly extended the drawing towards me. His fingers, stained Silas, slowly extended the drawing towards me. His fingers, stained with what looked like dried mud and something else, something reddish-brown that made my stomach churn, were surprisingly steady. He offered the paper as if it were a sacred text, a map to a hidden truth. I took it, my own hand trembling slightly as my fingers brushed against his cool, small ones. The paper was rough, the crayon marks thick and deliberate. The mangled toy boat, its mast broken, lay capsized in dark, choppy lines of blue and black. Above it, towering and indistinct, was the shadowy figure, a formless mass with two pinpricks of white that I now understood were meant to be eyes. They seemed to bore into me from the page. "What is this, Silas?" I asked again, my voice barely a thread. "What have you seen?" He did not answer immediately. His gaze, still fixed on mine, held an unnerving stillness, a depth that seemed to pull at the edges of my own perception. It was not the wide-eyed innocence of a child, but something ancient, something that had witnessed truths I was not yet ready to comprehend. His small chest rose and fell with shallow breaths. His lips parted slightly, but no sound escaped. He simply stared, a silent accusation or a plea, I could not tell which. My gaze flickered from his face back to the drawing, the mangled boat, the towering shadow. It was crude, yes, but undeniably powerful. The dark lines of the water seemed to swirl. The white pinprick eyes glowed with an internal malevolence that transcended the simple crayon medium. And then I noticed it, a detail that had eluded me in my initial shock. Along the bottom edge of the paper, barely visible beneath the churning blue and black, were faint, scrawled letters. They were disjointed, childlike, but legible enough. I leaned closer, my breath catching in my throat. The letters were, indeed, crude, formed with the unsteady hand of a child, but the meaning solidified with chilling clarity. HEWAITSBENEATH. The words hammered into my skull, a cold, sharp echo of the dread already settling in my chest. He waits beneath. The simple declarative sentence, scrawled by a child's hand, was infinitely more terrifying than any elaborate monster story. It spoke of patience, of an inevitable presence, an unseen horror biding its time. My eyes snapped back to the boy. He had not moved, his gaze still fixed on me, unblinking. There was no triumph in his expression, no childish mischief, only that profound, ancient knowing. He had delivered his message. He had drawn his warning. And now he merely observed my reaction, as if testing the limits of my comprehension. A shiver, not of cold but of primal fear, traced its way down my spine. My hand, still holding the drawing, trembled slightly. I wanted to ask him, to demand an explanation, to shake him out of his silent vigil and force him to speak. But the words caught in my throat. What could I ask? Who waits? What is beneath? The questions felt futile, lost in the unnerving stillness of the moment. The air in the small room seemed to thicken, heavy with unspoken things. The flickering lamp cast long, dancing shadows that made the familiar objects around me seem alien, menacing. The rough-hewn walls of the cabin, once a symbol of rustic comfort, now pressed in, suddenly too close, too confining. I swallowed, my mouth dry. My gaze drifted once more to the drawing. The mangled boat, the towering shadow, the swirling dark lines of the water. And now, the chilling caption, "He waits beneath." It was no longer a child's fantasy. It was a premonition, a truth whispered from the depths of some forgotten horror. The boy finally stirred, a slow, deliberate movement. He lifted a small hand, pointing a tiny finger not at the drawing, but towards the window, towards the impenetrable darkness beyond the cabin walls. His lips parted again, and for a fleeting moment, I thought he would speak. But no sound emerged. Only a slight, almost imperceptible tremor in his tiny frame, like a leaf caught in an unseen current. Then, a soft voice from the doorway. It was the grandmother. Her silhouette, framed by the faint light from the main room, seemed to absorb the surrounding gloom. "Come, child," she said. Her tone was low, calm, almost soothing, yet it held an undercurrent of something else, something I couldn't quite decipher. A weariness, perhaps, or a resignation. The boy's gaze lingered on me for another heartbeat, a silent exchange of understanding, or perhaps a final, desperate warning. Then he turned and walked towards his grandmother, his small form disappearing into the shadow of the doorway without a backward glance. I was left alone, the drawing still clutched in my hand, back, and asked if I was finally tired of the big city rat race. I told him I was, but there was something else, something important. I started cautiously, mentioning my grandmother's journals, the missing files from the library. Sam listened, his expression shifting from casual interest to a focused intensity I hadn't seen in years. When I mentioned the old mill and the water quality reports, he put down the wrench he was holding. He said he remembered Alara talking about that she had been a real pain in the neck for some of the town's bigwigs back then. He also quietly confessed that his own father, a former employee at the mill, had suffered from a rare respiratory illness in his later years, an illness the doctors couldn't quite explain. He had always wondered if it was connected to his years working at the mill, exposed to whatever chemicals they used. That was it. The personal connection, the shared suspicion, Sam was in. He suggested we bring in Amelia. Amelia Rodriguez was Cedar Creek's resident tech wizard, a brilliant young woman who ran the town's only computer repair shop. She was quiet, unassuming, but possessed a razor-sharp intellect and an uncanny ability to find information that others swore didn't exist. She was also fiercely independent, a rarity in a town where conformity was often prized. Amelia, Sam explained, had a personal stake too. Her family had lived near Miller's Creek for generations, and her younger brother had developed a chronic skin condition that doctors attributed to unknown environmental factors. Meeting Amelia felt like recruiting a hacker for a secret mission. She listened intently as Sam and I laid out our fragmented suspicions, the missing documents, the odd illnesses, the mill's sudden closure. She didn't interrupt, her dark eyes tracking our words with an almost unsettling focus. When we finished, she simply nodded. She said she had noticed strange things, too, anomalies in public record databases, small inconsistencies in municipal reports that she had dismissed as clerical errors. She admitted she had even tried to access some of the older, digitized town council minutes, only to find them mysteriously corrupted or incomplete. She explained that she had always suspected something wasn't right, but without concrete evidence, it was just a hunch. Now with Alara's journals, she felt a surge of validation. She agreed to help, her quiet determination a powerful force, and so our little band of truth-seekers was formed. 3 unlikely allies, bound by a shared sense of unease and a growing conviction that Cedar Creek's serene facade hid a deeply troubling secret. We decided to call ourselves the Watchers, a nod to my grandmother's tireless, often solitary, vigilance. Our headquarters became my grandmother's dusty, memory-filled living room, the journals spread out on the old oak table like ancient scrolls. Our first task was to systematically cross-reference Alara's notes with whatever public records Amelia could unearth. It was painstaking work, sifting through decades of town council minutes. The words HEWAITS, BENEATH, burning themselves into my mind. The silence that followed their departure was profound, broken only by the distant, rhythmic sigh of the sea against the shore. It was a sound that had once brought me peace, a comforting lullaby. Now it was a sinister whisper, a promise of something unseen stirring in the dark waters. I sank onto the old wooden chair, the drawing still in my grip. My mind raced, trying to process what had just happened. A child, no older than 5 or 6, had drawn a terrifying image and then, with an almost preternatural calm, had presented it to me with a chilling message. And his eyes. Those ancient, knowing eyes. Rationality fought a losing battle against the burgeoning dread. Children have vivid imaginations, I told myself. They absorb stories, fears, local legends. Perhaps the grandmother, or some other islander, had inadvertently filled his head with tales of sea monsters and unseen dangers. It was a remote island, after all. Superstition often thrived in such isolated places. But then, I remembered his gaze, the utter conviction in his silent stare. It wasn't the wide-eyed wonder of a child listening to a scary story. It was the solemn declaration of someone who had witnessed a truth. And the pointing finger towards the dark sea. I looked at the drawing again. The crude lines, the vibrant, almost aggressive colors. The black shadow was not just a shape, it was a presence, a malevolent force radiating from the paper. The white pinprick eyes seemed to follow me, even as I tried to avert my gaze. I needed air. I needed to escape the suffocating atmosphere of the cabin. I pushed myself up from the chair, the drawing still in my hand. My legs felt heavy, as if weighted down by an invisible force. I walked to the window, peering out into the night. The moon was a sliver, barely visible through a thin veil of clouds. The stars were sparse, swallowed by the oppressive darkness. The sea, it stretched out before me, an endless expanse of black. I could hear its ceaseless murmur, a low, guttural rumble that seemed to emanate from the very depths. He waits beneath. The words echoed in my ears, amplified by the sound of the waves. I spent the rest of the night in a state of agitated wakefulness. I tried to read, to distract myself with the familiar comfort of words, but the sentences blurred, the meaning lost in the relentless replay of the boy's silent message. Every creak of the old cabin, every gust of wind against the windows, every distant cry of a seabird was magnified, imbued with a sinister significance. I found myself repeatedly drawn to the window, staring out at the black expanse of the ocean. My imagination, usually a source of creative solace, now turned against me. Conjuring grotesque shapes in the swirling darkness, imagining vast, unseen horrors lurking just beneath the surface, I pictured colossal tentacles, eyes as large as dinner plates, ancient leviathans stirring from eons of slumber. As dawn approached, painting the sky with bruised purples and grays, a sense of exhaustion finally allowed me a few hours of fitful sleep. But even in slumber, the images persisted. I dreamt of being pulled down into an abyss of crushing darkness, a silent scream trapped in my throat as something vast and unseen enveloped me. I awoke with a gasp, my body slick with sweat, the memory of the dream clinging to me like a shroud. The first rays of sunlight, weak and watery, offered little comfort. The cabin felt cold, hollow. The drawing lay on the small table where I had left it, the black shadow seeming even darker in the pale morning light. I knew I couldn't simply dismiss this. The child's intensity, the chilling message, the drawing itself, it had all struck too deep a chord. My grief had made me vulnerable, perhaps, but it had not made me delusional. There was something here, something profoundly unsettling that demanded investigation. After a quick, unsatisfying breakfast of stale bread and cold coffee, I decided my first step had to be the grandmother. She was the child's guardian, the one who knew him best. She might offer some explanation, some context that would allow me to rationalize the unsettling encounter. I walked the short path to their cabin, the air crisp and damp with the morning mist. The familiar scent of pine and salt filled my nostrils, but today it offered no comfort. My senses were heightened, alert to every rustle in the undergrowth, every distant cry of a gull. I felt exposed, vulnerable, as if the very island itself had become hostile. The grandmother's cabin was a mirror image of my own, rustic and weathered. A thin plume of smoke curled lazily from its stone chimney. I knocked softly on the heavy wooden door, my heart thumping a nervous rhythm against my ribs. The door creaked open, revealing the grandmother. Her face was etched with lines. Her eyes, though clouded with age, held a sharp, knowing intelligence. She wore a simple dark dress, and her gray hair was pulled back in a neat bun. She regarded me with an unreadable expression. "Good morning," I managed, my voice a little hoarse. "I hope I am not disturbing you." She merely nodded, her gaze steady. "Come in," she said, her voice surprisingly soft, a gentle rasp. I stepped inside, into a small, sparsely furnished room. A fire crackled in the hearth, casting a warm glow that did little to dispel the chill I felt. The air smelled of wood smoke and something else, something earthy and ancient, like dried herbs or old timber. The boy was nowhere in sight. I had to ask about the drawing, I began, holding it out to her. "He gave this to me last night." She took the drawing from my hand, her fingers surprisingly strong. She looked at it for a long moment, her expression unchanging. Her gaze lingered on the black shadow, then on the words at the bottom. A sigh, almost imperceptible, escaped her lips. "He sees things," she said finally, her voice low. "Things others do not." My breath hitched. "Sees things? What kind of things?" I pressed, my voice eager, desperate for answers. She turned her gaze from the drawing to me, her eyes piercing. "The old ways. The deep things. He has the gift." "The gift?" I echoed, confusion warring with a growing sense of unease. "What gift?" "A connection," she explained, her voice dropping almost to a whisper. "To what lies beneath. To the old ones. The ones who ruled these waters before man sailed upon them." My mind reeled. "Old ones? You mean like folklore? Legends?" Her lips curved into a faint, sad smile. "Legends are often shadows of truth, my son. Distorted perhaps, but rooted in something real. This island, it remembers. The sea, it remembers more. And some of us, we feel its memory." She looked at the drawing again, her fingers tracing the edge of the paper. "This shadow," she said, "it is not just a shadow. It is a presence, an ancient hunger." My blood ran cold. Hunger. What does it hunger for? She looked up at me again, her gaze unwavering. "Souls. Life. What the sea claims." I felt a dizzying sensation, as if the floor beneath me had suddenly tilted. This was too much. This was beyond folklore, beyond superstition. This was a direct, chilling confirmation of my deepest fears. "The boy," I stammered. "Does he understand what he draws? What he writes?" "He understands what he feels," she replied. "He feels the pull, the presence. He is a conduit, a warning. A warning for whom? For the island? For me?" She was silent for a moment, her eyes seeming to gaze into a distant past, or perhaps a terrifying future. "For all who forget the power of the deep. for all who venture too far, for those who are lost. Lost? I thought of my own journey here, my escape from grief, my longing for solitude. Was I one of the lost? She handed the drawing back to me. "Keep it," she said. "It is for you. A message." I took the drawing, my fingers brushing hers. They felt cold, despite the warmth of the fire. "What should I do?" I asked, feeling a desperate need for guidance. She shook her head slowly. "You must listen. Listen to the sea. Listen to your heart. And be careful. The deep is patient, and it is always watching." With that, she turned and walked towards a curtained alcove, disappearing behind it. I stood there for a moment, the drawing heavy in my hand, the weight of her words settling upon me. He sees things, the old ones. An ancient hunger. I left her cabin in a daze, the morning air feeling sharper, colder than before. The world outside seemed to have shifted, its familiar contours now imbued with a hidden menace. The gentle lapping of the waves against the shore now sounded like a slow, deliberate breathing. The cries of the gulls seemed more like mournful wails. Back in my own cabin, I spread the drawing on my table, staring at it as if it held the key to some terrible secret. Which, I now realized, it very well might. My initial attempts at rationalization had crumbled under the grandmother's calm, unwavering conviction. She believed it. And the child's eyes. He knew it. I felt a strange compulsion, an inexplicable pull towards the sea. It was as if the words HEWAITSBENEATH had imprinted themselves not just on my mind but on my very soul, drawing me towards the source of the dread. I fought against it, a desperate need to stay away, to retreat into the safety of the cabin, to ignore the terrifying implications. But the pull was stronger. I grabbed my coat, a thick woolen one that offered little protection against the chill that seemed to emanate from within me. I walked down the familiar path to the beach, the crunch of gravel beneath my boots, the only sound in the oppressive silence. The beach was deserted, as always. The gray sands stretched out to meet the churning gray water, a desolate landscape. The waves crashed with a dull roar, pulling back with a hiss, revealing glistening patches of wet sand and scattered shells. I walked to the water's edge, the cold spray kissing my face. I stood there for a long time, staring out at the vast, indifferent ocean. It looked so ordinary, so deceptively calm in its endless power. But beneath that surface, I now knew, something stirred. Something ancient and hungry. I thought of the reasons I had come to this island. To escape. To heal. To find peace. Instead, I had stumbled into a nightmare, a reality far more terrifying than any grief I had known. My personal sorrow, once all-consuming, now seemed insignificant in the face of this cosmic dread. I knew I needed to learn more. The grandmother's words had opened a door, but they had also left me with more questions than answers. Old ones. Ancient hunger. How did one fight something so vast, so primordial? Or did one simply succumb? The small island community had a tiny library, more of a collection of old books and local records, housed in a dusty room attached to the general store. It was rarely visited, mostly by a few curious tourists or the occasional academic studying island folklore. I decided to head there. The general store was a small, cluttered space that smelled of salt, old wood, and dried fish. A bell above the door jingled a mournful tune as I entered. Mrs. Riesel Bar Periwinkle, a woman whose face was a roadmap of wrinkles and worry lines, looked up from behind the counter. Her eyes, usually sharp and inquisitive, held a new, distant glaze. She merely nodded a greeting, her usual chatter conspicuously absent. Even the air in the store felt heavier, charged with an unspoken tension. I walked past shelves crammed with tinned goods and fishing tackle towards a narrow, creaking door at the back. It opened into a single room dimly lit by a single bare bulb hanging from the ceiling. Dust motes danced in the anemic light, disturbed by my entrance. The air was thick with the scent of aged paper and forgotten stories. Books lined haphazard shelves, some leaning precariously, others stacked in tottering piles on the floor. It was a repository of the island's collective memory, or what little of it remained. I began my search methodically, starting with the local history section, if one could call it that. There were worn copies of island gazetteers, lists of past inhabitants, and a few amateurish attempts at chronicling the island's fishing industry. Nothing about ancient entities or hungry oceans. I ran my fingers over faded spines, each book a silent testament to lives lived and forgotten on this isolated rock. My own life, so recently shattered, felt like just another fragile story waiting to be lost to the tide. Hours bled into one another. My eyes grew tired, blurring the archaic script and yellowed pages. I found accounts of severe storms, of fishing boats lost without a trace, of lean years when the catches dwindled to nothing. These were common enough maritime tragedies, yet a pattern began to emerge, subtle at first, like a faint current beneath the surface. The lean years often seemed to coincide with a greater number of inexplicable disappearances, not just of boats, but of individuals, sometimes entire families, simply vanishing from their homes. The official records offered mundane explanations: migration, accidental drownings, rough seas. But the local accounts, often scribbled in the margins of old ledgers or tucked into personal diaries, hinted at something darker. I found a small, leather-bound journal, its cover flaking, its pages brittle. It bore no title, no author. It looked like a personal diary, perhaps from a long-dead islander. The handwriting was cramped, the ink faded, but legible. It spoke of mundane daily life, weather observations, fishing hauls. Then, abruptly, the tone shifted. Entries became sparse, haunted. The writer, a fisherman named Elias, began to record strange occurrences. An unnatural calm that settled over the sea for days. The unsettling sight of schools of fish swimming in tight, frantic circles. An almost palpable presence in the deep. One entry, dated over a century ago, sent a chill down my spine. It read, "The ocean has a hunger, a deep and ancient maw. It stirs when the land sleeps, and it calls when the moon is full. We give it our due, but sometimes its appetite grows beyond measure." The words echoed the grandmother's warning. Elias spoke of rituals, of offerings made at the darkest hour, of sacrifices to appease the deep. He described a collective fear that gripped the island during these times, a quiet terror that permeated every home. He wrote of lights seen far out at sea, not from ships, but from something vast and formless moving beneath the waves. My heart hammered against my ribs. This was it. This was the thread connecting the whispers to the reality. Elias's journal was not a work of fiction. It was a desperate chronicle of a man living on the edge of an abyss. He spoke of the elders, the keepers of the old ways, who understood the cycles of the hunger. He detailed how they would gather at the highest point of the island, chanting, casting things into the churning waters, hoping to sap the beast, or at least divert its attention. He mentioned the fear of the deep sleep, when the ocean became too calm, too quiet, a sign that the entity was gorging itself, drawing everything into its silent embrace. I continued to read, my fingers trembling as I turned the fragile pages. Elias described a particular year, a year of unparalleled calm and prosperity, followed by a sudden, devastating famine. The ocean, he wrote, had been too generous, lulling them into a false sense of security. And then it had demanded its payment. Many disappeared that year, not just the old and infirm, but the young, the strong, the very lifeblood of the community. Elias himself recounted seeing strange, iridescent lights moving through the water near his boat one moonless night. He felt a profound, chilling sense of being watched, of being desired. He never went out alone again after that. His last entry was terse, desperate. The hunger is upon us. The old ones say it has woken fully. May the deep have mercy on our souls. The journal ended there, abruptly, leaving me to wonder what became of Elias. I looked around the dusty library, no longer seeing a collection of forgotten books, but a silent archive of horror. Every missing person report, every account of an unexplained tragedy, every cryptic local saying now took on a terrifying new meaning. The islanders were not merely superstitious. They were survivors, living generations under the shadow of something incomprehensible. The grandmother's words returned to me with frightening clarity. It has woken fully. Was this what Elias had feared? Was this what was happening now? The recent disappearances, the unseasonable warmth, the unsettling calm of the sea. They were not anomalies, but symptoms. The entity, whatever it was stirring. I found another book, much older, bound in some kind of dark, stiff hide. Its pages were not paper, but thin sheets of what felt like dried, pressed seaweed, covered in strange angular symbols and crude drawings. It was not in any language I recognized, but the illustrations were universally chilling. They depicted grotesque, amorphous shapes, in the deep, tendrils reaching towards the surface, pulling down tiny, struggling figures. There were images of islanders, eyes wide with terror, offering up strange objects, or even themselves, to the depths. This was not a historical record. It was a grimoire, a book of forbidden knowledge, a guide to appeasing something ancient and malevolent. It spoke of cycles, of the moon's influence, of specific tides and alignments, when the veil between worlds thinned. It detailed specific offerings, not just food or trinkets, but life itself, the essence of vitality. It hinted at a consciousness, not human, but vast and alien, residing in the abyssal plains beneath the island. It consumed not just flesh, but hope, joy, memory. It fed on the very fabric of existence, leaving behind only emptiness and despair. I felt a cold dread seep into my bones, a primal terror that transcended anything I had ever known. My personal grief, the raw wound of loss that had driven me to this island, now seemed like a distant echo. It was a human pain, understandable, finite. This was something else entirely. This was cosmic dread, the fear of the unknowable, the overwhelming realization of humanity's utter insignificance in the face of true, primordial horror. My initial reasons for coming to this island, to escape, to heal, to find peace, now felt like a cruel joke. I had sought refuge from a personal nightmare, only to stumble into one that encompassed the entire world, or at least this corner of it. The island was not a sanctuary. It was a cage, and the bars were closing in. The book of hide and seaweed contained references to a particular time, a window when the hunger was most profound, when its influence was strongest. It spoke of a specific alignment of stars, a certain phase of the moon, and a particular tide. I cross-referenced this with Elias's journal and the local gazetteers. The pattern was undeniable. These were the times when the disappearances peaked, when the ocean seemed to hold its breath, when the islanders spoke in hushed tones and locked their doors. And then, a horrifying realization hit me. The current conditions, the phase of the moon, the rising tide, the unseasonable calm, they all aligned with the descriptions in the ancient texts. We were in the midst of one of those windows. The entity was not merely stirring, it was actively feeding. The recent disappearances were not isolated incidents. They were part of a larger, terrifying cycle that had begun anew. The implications were staggering. The islanders were not just living with this thing, they were living for it. Their existence was a delicate dance between appeasement and survival. And now, it seemed, the dance was becoming more desperate. I closed the ancient book, its strange symbols seeming to pulse with malevolent energy in the dim light. My hands were shaking uncontrollably. I had sought answers, and I had found them. But the answers were worse than any question I could have imagined. How did one fight something that was older than time, something that was an intrinsic part of the ocean itself? How did one even begin to comprehend a consciousness so alien, so vast, so utterly indifferent to human life? The grandmother's warnings, once dismissed as old wives' tales, now resonated with terrifying truth. She knew. She had always known. And the fear in her eyes, the weariness in her voice, was not just the burden of age, but the weight of generations of knowledge about an unspeakable horror. I gathered the journal and the strange book, intending to take them with me. I needed to study them further, away from the oppressive atmosphere of the library. As I turned to leave, my gaze fell upon a small, framed photograph tucked behind a stack of dusty almanacs. It was a faded black and white image of a young man, perhaps in his early 20s, standing proudly beside a fishing boat. His smile was bright, his eyes full of life. Taped to the bottom of the frame was a small, handwritten note, Elias, 1912. He was the author of the journal. His vibrant image, full of youthful hope, was a stark contrast to the despair of his final entry. What had become of him? Had he been one of the consumed? A sudden, sharp crack echoed from outside, like a branch snapping under immense pressure. It startled me, making me jump. Then, another, closer this time. It sounded like something was breaking, something large and wooden. A wave of unease washed over me, stronger than before. It was as if the island itself was groaning under the weight of the ancient hunger. I clutched the books tighter, my mind racing. I had to talk to the grandmother again. She was the only one who truly understood. But first, I needed to understand more, to piece together the fragments of this horrifying puzzle. The small community, once a balm for my wounded soul, now felt like a trap, its inhabitants unwitting sacrifices in a cosmic drama. The peace I had sought was an illusion, shattered by the cold, hard truth of the deep. As I stepped out of the library, the bell above the general store door jingled again, a sound that now seemed less mournful and more like a warning. Mrs. Periwinkle was gone from behind the counter. The store was empty, save for myself. A chill wind swept through the open door, carrying with it the unmistakable scent of the ocean, a smell that no longer brought comfort, but only a creeping, suffocating dread. The sky outside had turned a bruised purple, and the air was still, heavy, pregnant with an unspoken threat. The calm of the sea, once so inviting, now felt like the held breath of a predator, waiting. I knew then that my time on this island was not about healing, but about survival. And I was not sure I would succeed. The bell's final, mournful echo died in the suffocating stillness. Mrs. Periwinkle was gone. The shelves, once reassuringly packed with the mundane necessities of island life, now loomed like silent sentinels, their contents mocking the emptiness. A cold dread, far deeper than the chill wind, seeped into my bones. I called her name, a strangled whisper swallowed by the air. Mrs. Periwinkle? Only the whisper of the wind through the open door answered, a sound like a sigh from something ancient and weary. My eyes darted around the store, searching for any sign, any disturbance. A dropped item, a scuff mark on the worn wooden floor, anything to explain her sudden vanishing. But there was nothing. The counter was neat, the cash register closed. It was as if she had simply ceased to be, dissolved into the very air. The implication was a gut punch. This was not a robbery, not a simple disappearance. It was something far more unsettling. My breath hitched in my throat. The air in the shop felt heavy, pressing in on me, stealing the oxygen. My heart hammered a frantic rhythm against my ribs, a desperate drumbeat in the sudden, profound silence. I forced myself to move, my legs feeling like leaden stilts. I checked behind the counter, half expecting her to pop up with a wry smile, a playful admonishment for my foolishness. But there was only empty space, the faint scent of lavender and old paper. I called her name again, louder this time, a raw, ragged sound that echoed off the high shelves and died. "Mrs. Periwinkle!" My voice cracked. The silence that followed was not just an absence of sound, but a presence, a cold, watchful entity. Panic, cold and sharp, began to prick at the edges of my composure. I moved methodically, though my mind was reeling. I checked the small back room, where she kept her meager living quarters. The kettle was still on the hob, a wisp of steam rising from its spout. A half-finished cup of herbal tea sat on a small, worn table next to an open book, its pages face down, a thin ribbon marking her place. A shawl, knitted in a familiar pattern, lay draped over the back of her favorite armchair. Everything was exactly as she would have left it for a moment, a brief errand, but she had not left. She had vanished. I peered out the back door. It led to a small, enclosed yard, mostly used for hanging laundry. The line was empty. The shed where she stored gardening tools was locked. No footprints in the damp earth, no sign of struggle, nothing. It was as if the island itself had swallowed her whole, without so much as a ripple on its ancient surface. My gaze returned to the open book on her table. It was a collection of local folklore, stories of the island's past. I remembered her mentioning it, saying she liked to reread the old tales, finding comfort in their familiar rhythm. I didn't touch it. The scene was too perfectly preserved, a snapshot of a life abruptly paused. A shiver traced its way down my spine, independent of the cold wind. This wasn't right. People didn't just disappear. Not like this. Not Mrs. Periwinkle. She was an institution, as much a part of the island's fabric as the ancient stones and the relentless sea. She had been here longer than anyone could remember, her presence a constant, reassuring anchor in the shifting currents of island life. My mind raced, trying to grasp at any logical thread. Had she gone out for something? But the front door was open, the bell silent. She would never leave the shop unattended like that. Never. Not even for a moment. She was meticulous, dependable, a creature of habit. I stumbled back into the main shop, my hands shaking. I needed to tell someone. But who? The island was small, isolated. There was no police station, no formal authority beyond the loose council of elders and the distant mainland coast guard. Old Man Hemlock, perhaps. He lived closest, a crotchety but sharp-witted fisherman whose weathered face held the stories of 100 storms. My feet moved on their own accord, carrying me towards the front door. The wind, now a mournful howl, whipped through the open entrance, sending a flurry of dust motes dancing in the dim light. I hesitated at the threshold, glancing back at the silent shop, a sense of profound wrongness permeating every inch of it. It was no longer just a shop. It was a tomb of unanswered questions. Stepping out, the salty air hit me with a jolt. The sky was a bruised purple, the sea a churning gray. The storm that had been brewing all day was gathering strength, mirroring the chaos in my own mind. I pulled my coat tighter, the worn fabric offering little comfort against the encroaching chill. The path to Old Man Hemlock's cottage was rocky and uneven, clinging to the cliff edge. The wind tugged at my hair, trying to snatch my thoughts away. Every shadow seemed to lengthen. Every rustle of the sparse vegetation sounded like a whispered warning. I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see Mrs. Periwinkle emerge from the shop, perhaps having played some elaborate, uncharacteristic prank. But the shop remained still, its open door a gaping maw into the mystery. I reached Hemlock's cottage, a squat, stone structure that seemed to grow organically from the rock face. Smoke curled lazily from its chimney, a comforting sign of life. I hammered on the heavy wooden door, my knuckles aching with the impact. "Hemlock!" I shouted, my voice barely audible above the wind's roar. "Hemlock! It's me! Something's happened!" After a moment, the door creaked open, revealing Hemlock's craggy face, framed by a thick white beard. His eyes, though rheumy with age, were surprisingly sharp. He held a pipe clutched in one gnarled hand. "Aye, lad," environmental reports, property deeds, and old newspaper clippings. The early days of our investigation were slow, punctuated by moments of frustration and the occasional flicker of hope. Amelia spent hours hunched over her laptop, her fingers flying across the keyboard, navigating layers of digital bureaucracy. She discovered that many of the town's historical documents, especially those concerning land use and industrial regulations, were either digitized poorly or had significant gaps. It was as if someone had deliberately created an information void, making it incredibly difficult to trace ownership or responsibility back more than a few decades. She noted that many of these gaps conveniently coincided with the periods my grandmother had highlighted in her journals as times of particular concern. Sam, with his extensive network of contacts, became our eyes and ears on the ground. He subtly asked questions at the hardware store, at the diner, at the weekly Rotary Club meetings. He listened to the whispers, the offhand remarks, the unspoken resentments that simmered beneath the surface of small-town life. He learned that many older residents harbored their own suspicions about the mill's closure, about the strange illnesses, about the sudden wealth of certain town figures. But fear, he explained, was a powerful deterrent. People were afraid of losing their jobs, their livelihoods, their standing in the community. They had seen what happened to others who spoke out, how their businesses mysteriously struggled, how their reputations were quietly undermined. My role was to connect the dots, to synthesize the information, and to interpret Alara's increasingly cryptic notes. Her later entries were less direct, more coded, as if she knew her journals might be discovered. She wrote of the Iron Hand, a powerful, unseen force that controlled the town. She spoke of the Silent Pact, an agreement among a few powerful families to maintain their grip on Cedar Creek. She even hinted at a location, a place where the truth was buried, literally and figuratively. She used phrases like the Whispering Woods and the Dark Pool, names that sounded like something out of a fairy tale, but in the context of her grim observations, felt deeply sinister. One evening, as a late summer storm rattled the windows of my grandmother's house, Amelia finally hit something substantial. She had been digging into old zoning permits for the land where the mill once stood. She found a series of amendments, pushed through with remarkable speed and minimal public disclosure, that significantly altered the environmental regulations for industrial sites in Cedar Creek, specifically reducing requirements for waste disposal and water purity monitoring. These amendments were passed in the early 2000s, precisely when my grandmother's notes indicated the water quality issues began. The key signatures on these documents were consistently those of Mayor Thomas Blackwood, a man who had been in office for an astonishing 30 years, and Robert Thorne, the CEO of Thorne Industries, the company that had owned the mill for decades before its sudden sale. This was our first concrete link. "What's all this racket?" he grumbled, his voice raspy like grinding stones. "You look like you've seen a ghost." "Worse, Hemlock," I gasped, clutching at my chest, trying to catch my breath. "It's Mrs. Periwinkle. She's gone. Vanished." Hemlock's bushy eyebrows shot up. His pipe dropped from his lips, clattering to the stone step. "Gone? What in the blazes are you talking about, boy?" I explained, stumbling over my words, the story sounding even more preposterous when spoken aloud. I went to the shop. The bell rang. She wasn't there. The back room, the kettle, the book. Nothing. Just gone. Hemlock stared at me, his face unreadable for a long moment. Then, a flicker of something passed through his eyes. Not disbelief, but a deep, ancient understanding. He stepped back, opening the door wider. "Come in, lad. You're soaked. We'll talk by the fire." I stepped into the small, warm cottage. The scent of wood smoke and dried fish, a stark contrast to the cold dread outside. Hemlock gestured to a worn armchair by the hearth. He poked at the embers, sending a shower of sparks up the chimney. "Now, tell me clearly," he said, turning to face me, his gaze piercing. every detail. I recounted everything again, trying to be as precise as possible, though the memory was already blurring into a nightmarish haze. The bell, the silence, the empty shop, the perfectly preserved back room. He listened, nodding occasionally, his eyes fixed on the dancing flames. When I finished, the only sound was the crackle of the fire and the distant roar of the sea. "No sign of a struggle, you say? No broken window, no forced lock?" he asked. "No," I confirmed. "Nothing. Just as if she walked out and dissolved into thin air." Hemlock stroked his beard thoughtfully. "That's not like our Mrs. Periwinkle. She's a fixture, that one. Never leaves the shop unattended, not even for a minute." "That's what I thought," I said, my voice barely a whisper. What could have happened? He sighed, a deep, weary sound that seemed to carry the weight of generations. He rose and walked to a small, cluttered shelf, pulling down a dusty, leather-bound book. It looked ancient, its pages brittle. "There are stories, lad," he began, his voice low, almost a murmur. "Stories the folk on the mainland laugh at. Stories of the island, of things that dwell here, unseen." I remembered Mrs. Periwinkle's own book, The Folklore. My blood ran cold. "You mean, what kind of stories?" Hemlock opened the book, his finger tracing a line of faded script. "The island, you see, it has its moods, its currents, its appetites. Sometimes, rarely, it takes." "Takes?" I repeated, a knot forming in my stomach. "What do you mean, takes?" He looked up, his eyes meeting mine, grave and unwavering. "It means, lad, that folk simply vanish. No trace, no explanation. Just gone. The sea doesn't claim them, for no body washes ashore. No storm carries them away, for the sky is clear. They simply cease to be. A cold wave washed over me, colder than any wind." This was not the kind of answer I had sought. This was a nightmare-given voice. But that's just old wives' tales, isn't it?" I stammered, desperate for a rational explanation, for something tangible to fight against. "People don't just vanish." Hemlock closed the book with a soft thud. "Don't they now?" He raised an eyebrow. "You just came from Mrs. Periwinkle's shop, didn't you? What did you find there?" His words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken implication. The logical part of my brain screamed for scientific reason, for police reports, for a search party. But the other part, the part that had grown up on this strange, isolated rock, felt a prickle of recognition, a chilling resonance with Hemlock's words. "Who else?" I asked, my voice barely audible. "Who else has vanished?" He leaned back in his chair, staring into the fire. "Old man McTavish, nearly 50 years ago. Went out to check his lobster pots, never returned. Boat was found adrift, empty, no sign of him. Young Ilara, the schoolmistress, barely 20, said she was going for a walk along the cliffs. Her scarf was found near the Devil's Tooth, but no body, no trace. The mainlanders sent their finest, their dogs, their boats. Nothing. They eventually put it down to the treacherous cliffs, the wild sea. But we, the islanders, we knew." A profound silence descended, broken only by the crackle of the fire and the distant, mournful cry of a seabird. The storm outside seemed to intensify, its roar a fitting soundtrack to Hemlock's grim narrative. "So what do we do?" I asked, feeling utterly helpless. "Just accept it?" Hemlock shook his head slowly. "No, we don't accept it. We search. We always search. But we do so with our eyes open to what might truly be." He stood up, his movements surprisingly spry for his age. "Grab your coat, lad. We'll go back to the shop. Maybe we missed something. And then we'll rouse the others. This kind of news travels fast enough on its own, but it's best if it comes from us." As we stepped back out into the gathering gloom, the wind was a roaring tempest, whipping spray from the crashing waves high onto the cliff path. The air was thick with the scent of salt and impending rain. The world felt smaller, more dangerous, as if the island itself was drawing in its breath, preparing for something. We made our way back to Mrs. Periwinkle's shop, the wind buffeting us, trying to push us back. The open door now looked less like an oversight and more like an invitation. Inside, the silence was even more pronounced after the howling gale. Hemlock moved with a quiet purpose, his lamp casting long, dancing shadows that seemed to writhe with unspoken secrets. He meticulously examined the floorboards, the shelves, the counter. He went into the back room, his lamp illuminating every nook and cranny. He picked up the open book, studying the page Mrs. Periwinkle had been reading. It was a tale of the Selkie folk, shapeshifters who could shed their sealskins and walk among humans, only to return to the sea if their skin was lost or stolen, or if the call of the deep became too strong. A strange choice for Mrs. Periwinkle, I thought, given her practical nature. But perhaps she enjoyed the escapism. Hemlock grunted, closing the book gently. Nothing amiss here. Nothing at all. It's too clean. Too perfect. His words echoed my own earlier thoughts. The very absence of disturbance was the most disturbing thing of all. We need to tell the others, I repeated, feeling the urgency press down on me. Aye, he agreed, blowing out his lamp. But first we secure the shop. We don't want any well-meaning folk trampling over what little there might be. He pulled the heavy wooden doors shut, the ancient hinges groaning in protest. He fumbled with a large, rusty padlock and chain, securing the shop as best he could. The clang of the padlock was a final, mournful note, sealing Mrs. Periwinkle's absence. Our next stop was the lighthouse. Elias, the keeper, was a solitary man, but he was also one of the few with a direct line to the mainland in emergencies. His stoic nature would be a good counterpoint to the rising panic. The climb to the lighthouse was arduous, especially in the strengthening storm. Rain began to fall, cold and stinging, driven sideways by the wind. When we finally reached the sturdy, whitewashed tower, Elias met us at the door, his face grim. He must have seen our approach through the driving rain, or perhaps felt the shift in the island's mood. "What is it?" he asked, his voice calm but his eyes wary. "The weather's turning foul." "Mrs. Periwinkle," Hemlock announced, his voice carrying surprising authority over the wind. "She's gone, vanished from her shop. No trace." Elias's face remained impassive, but a flicker of something, perhaps resignation, crossed his features. He was an islander born and bred, knew the old tales as well as anyone. "Come in," he said, stepping aside. "You're soaked." Inside the lighthouse, the warmth was a welcome relief. The powerful beams swept rhythmically across the churning sea, a comforting constant in a world that suddenly felt unmoored. We explained everything again, the details becoming more ingrained in my mind with each retelling. Elias listened patiently, his gaze fixed on the storm-lashed windows. "He's right," Elias said, after we finished. "The island has a way of reclaiming its own sometimes, but we must follow procedure. I'll contact the mainland Coast Guard. They'll want details. A search will be mounted." He moved to his radio equipment, his movements precise and efficient. As he began to speak into the crackling device, his voice calm and professional, I felt a faint glimmer of hope. The mainland, with its logic and its resources, would surely find her. They wouldn't simply accept the island's ancient whispers. But even as Elias relayed the sparse details, I couldn't shake Hemlock's words, or the chilling emptiness of Mrs. Periwinkle's shop. The mainlanders would search for a body, for a perpetrator, for a logical explanation. They would send boats and divers and perhaps even a helicopter. They would scour the cliffs and the beaches. But what if there was nothing to find? What if Hemlock was right, and the island had simply taken her? The thought was a cold, suffocating blanket. It wasn't just Mrs. Periwinkle's disappearance that terrified me, but the implication of it. If the island could simply make someone vanish, without a trace, then what did that mean for the rest of us? For me, the isolation of the island, once a comforting embrace, now felt like a suffocating trap. Elias finished his transmission, his face still grave. "They'll send a cutter at first light. weather permitting. But with this storm brewing, it might be delayed. He poured us strong, hot tea, the steam rising in the quiet room. The rhythmic sweep of the light, the wail of the wind, the low hum of the radio. These were the sounds of the island, but now they seemed to carry a new, ominous undertone. Hemlock took a sip of his tea, his eyes distant. "We should tell the others. They'll want to know. They'll want to help," I agreed. The small community, though often fractious, always pulled together in times of crisis. This was a crisis unlike any other, but the instinct to gather, to face the unknown together, was strong. As we descended from the lighthouse, the storm was in full fury. The wind shrieked like a banshee, and the rain lashed down with relentless force. The path was treacherous, slick with spray and mud. The sea below was a maelstrom of white foam and dark, churning water. The island felt alive, but not in a comforting way. It felt like a hungry beast, awakened by the storm, its ancient heart beating beneath our feet. I thought of Mrs. Periwinkle, her kind eyes, her gentle smile, her unwavering presence. And now, nothing. Just an empty shop, a half-finished cup of tea, and an open book of folklore. We went door to door, our figures hunched against the gale, delivering the news. Each time the reaction was the same: shock, disbelief, then a dawning comprehension, a flicker of fear in their eyes that mirrored my own. Old Man Hemlock's words, the ancient tales, were not so easily dismissed on this island. They were part of its very fabric, woven into the warp and weft of its existence. Molly, the baker, dropped a tray of fresh bread, the loaves scattering across her stone floor. Angus, the taciturn fisherman, simply shook his head, his gaze drifting out to the tumultuous sea. Young Finn, usually so full of boisterous energy, went pale, his eyes wide with a fear he didn't try to hide. The news spread like wildfire, carried by the wind, whispered through the narrow lanes. Soon, a small group had gathered at the community hall, a drafty old building usually reserved for Sunday sermons and infrequent dances. The atmosphere was heavy, charged with a mixture of grief, fear, and a desperate need for answers. Elias joined us, having finished his communication with the mainland. He explained the Coast Guard's plans for a search, but his words, though reassuring in their practicality, seemed to hang hollow in the air. We, the islanders, knew the limitations of such searches when the island itself decided to keep its secrets. Hemlock stood before the small assembly, his voice surprisingly strong despite the weariness etched on his face. "We will search," he declared. "Every cove, every crevice, every inch of this island. We will leave no stone unturned. But we must also understand what we are up against. This is not a simple disappearance. This is the island." His words were met with a thread we could finally pull. It wasn't just vague allegations anymore. It was official documentation, albeit buried deep within layers of digital red tape. Amelia's expression was grim. She said the changes were so drastic, so blatant, that it was almost unbelievable they had gone unnoticed or unchallenged for so long. She explained that the lack of public scrutiny was largely due to the way they were presented, bundled with innocuous-sounding administrative updates, slipped through during low-attendance council meetings. Sam, hearing this, slammed his fist on the table. He said he always knew Blackwood was a snake, but this was beyond anything he imagined. He told us Blackwood had always cultivated an image of the benevolent, grandfatherly mayor, always ready with a handshake and a folksy platitude. But behind that facade, Sam had seen a man who ruthlessly protected his own interests and those of his closest allies. Thorn Industries, Sam reminded us, was the dominant economic force in Cedar Creek for generations. The Thorn family practically owned the town, not just the mill, but also significant shares in the bank, the largest real estate holdings, and even the local newspaper. The picture began to sharpen, revealing the contours of a deeply entrenched power structure. The Iron Hand and the Silent Pact, as my grandmother called them, were not abstract concepts. They were the mayor, the Thorne family, and likely others whose names we hadn't yet uncovered. The stakes suddenly felt much higher. We weren't just investigating a historical wrong. We were challenging the very foundation of Cedar Creek's governance and economy. The idea of exposing this truth, of rocking the boat so violently, was both exhilarating and terrifying. We decided our next step needed to be more direct, but still cautious. We needed to confirm the environmental impact. Alara's journals mentioned an old, abandoned well on the outskirts of the former mill property, a place she suspected was used for illegal dumping. She described it as being near a cluster of old-growth maples, a landmark she had sketched in one of her notebooks. The Whispering Woods, she called the area. It was a long shot, but it was a physical location, something tangible we could investigate. The following Saturday, under the guise of a casual hike, the three of us ventured towards the old mill site. The land was overgrown, reclaimed by nature, a stark contrast to the bustling industrial complex it once was. The air hung heavy with humidity, and the sounds of the forest were amplified, making every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig, feel like an intrusion. Amelia, with her GPS-enabled phone, and Alara's faded sketch, led the way. Sam, ever practical, carried a small backpack with water, a first aid kit, and a couple of shovels. I felt a surge of nervous energy, a mix of apprehension and grim determination. This wasn't just a walk in the woods. It felt like walking into history, into a secret that had been deliberately buried. After about an hour of pushing through thick underbrush, Amelia stopped. She pointed towards a slight depression in the ground, partially concealed by ferns and moss. It was unmistakably the cluster of maples my grandmother had drawn, their ancient branches reaching towards the sky like gnarled fingers. And there, almost completely hidden, was a rusted metal grate, barely visible amidst the decaying leaves. This was it. The old well. The dark pool. A faint, acrid odor hung in the air around the well, a smell that made my stomach clench. It wasn't strong enough to be overwhelming, but it was distinct, chemical. Sam carefully pried at the grate with a crowbar he had brought. The metal groaned, protesting after years of neglect, but eventually yielded. We peered into the darkness. It was a deep shaft, the bottom obscured by shadow, but a sickly sheen on the water's surface was visible even in the dim light. It looked oily, unnatural. This was not clean, pure well water. This was something else entirely. Amelia, ever prepared, pulled out a small, portable water testing kit from her backpack. She lowered a sample bottle into the well, carefully collecting a small amount of the murky liquid. Her face was pale as she looked at the results. She said the pH levels were wildly off, far too acidic, and there were traces of heavy metals, highly toxic compounds, well beyond any safe limits. She explained that this wasn't just a minor spill. This was deliberate, long-term contamination. She said the sheer concentration suggested years of improper dumping. The implications hit us like a physical blow. This wasn't just about a few missing records or some vague illnesses. This was an environmental catastrophe, hidden in plain sight, poisoning the very earth and water that sustained Cedar Creek. The creek that fed the reservoir, the soil where local farmers grew their crops, the air that everyone breathed. It was all connected. And the timeline, Alara's timeline, perfectly matched the period when the mill's regulations were secretly relaxed. It was a cold, calculated act of corporate greed, enabled by corrupt local officials, at the expense of the health and well-being of an entire community. The air in Alara's small, cluttered lab grew heavy, thick with the unspoken weight of what we had just uncovered. A stunned silence fell over us, broken only by the hum of her equipment. My gut twisted, a cold knot of dread and fury coiling deep within. Cedar Creek. My home, the place I had always loved, despite its quiet decay, was being systematically poisoned. Not by some natural disaster, not by accident, but by design. I looked at Alara, her face still pale, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and grim determination. She was a scientist, driven by facts, but even she couldn't hide the horror of it. Beside her, the old man, Silas, had sunk onto a stool, his weathered hands gripping his knees. His gaze was fixed on the murky sample, a lifetime of quiet observation now coalescing into a terrible truth. He had seen the changes, the slow decline, the unexplained ailments that had plagued the town for years, dismissed as rural hardship or bad luck. Now he knew why. My own mind raced, a whirlwind of images, the sparkling creek of my childhood, the fish we used to catch, the taste of spring water from the taps. It was all tainted. The farmers, my neighbors who tilled the soil, nurtured their crops, believing in the land's bounty, the children, playing innocently by the water's edge. Every breath, every sip, every meal, potentially a slow dose of poison. The sheer audacity of it, the cold-blooded calculation required to maintain such a deception for so long, made my blood run cold. This wasn't just about the mill's output, but about its legacy, a toxic inheritance passed down through generations. And Ilara's timeline, the precise years when regulations were loosened, when specific officials were in power, when certain corporate decisions were made, it all painted a picture of a deliberate, coordinated effort. This wasn't just carelessness, it was malice. We needed to act. But how? Who could we trust? The very officials meant to protect the town were implicated. The thought of going to the local sheriff, a man whose family had ties to the mill for decades, felt like walking into a trap. This was bigger than Cedar Creek, bigger than just us. Ilara finally broke the silence, her voice a hushed whisper. This data, it's irrefutable. We have to be careful. The people who did this, they won't want it known. They have too much to lose. Silas slowly nodded. He spoke, his voice gravelly, laced with a bitterness I hadn't heard before. They've been losing things for years, boy. Folks gone missing, folks getting sick. Always just a coincidence, they said. Always. He looked at me, his eyes sharp. This explains a lot, doesn't it? The way things are, the way things have been. He was right. The strange illnesses, the apathy that seemed to settle over the town like a suffocating blanket, the subtle oddities I had noticed since my return, they all began to coalesce into a horrifying pattern. The missing people. Could the contamination be linked to their disappearances? Was it a side effect of exposure, or something more sinister, a means of silencing those who got too close? The thought sent a shiver down my spine. We spent the rest of the evening huddled in Ilara's lab, the air thick with tension and the smell of chemicals. We meticulously documented everything. Ilara photographed her findings, her notes, the detailed chemical analyses. She explained the specific heavy metals present, their devastating effects on the human body, the nervous system, the brain. She spoke of carcinogens, mutagens, compounds that could silently erode life from the inside out. It was a slow, agonizing death sentence for anyone exposed long enough. I thought of the old mill workers, their stooped shoulders, their hacking coughs, their pallid complexions. I thought of the children in the school, drinking the same water, breathing the same air. The anger welled up in me again, a hot, uncontrollable surge. We can't just sit on this, I said, my voice tight with suppressed rage. We have to expose them. Ilara looked at me, her gaze steady. We will. But we need more. This is just one sample from one location. We need to map the spread. We need undeniable proof of the source, and we need to link it directly to specific individuals, specific decisions. And we need to do it without alerting them. They have power, resources, and we, she gestured around the small lab, have a handful of test tubes and a lot of courage. Silas spoke up, his voice firm. I know the land. I know where the runoff goes, where the old pipes run. I can show you. He looked at me, a spark of resolve in his ancient eyes. We start there. Our plan began to take shape, born of desperation and a shared sense of moral outrage. We would become a clandestine investigative unit, moving in the shadows of Cedar Creek. Our first step: gather more samples. We needed to confirm the extent of the contamination, to show it wasn't an isolated incident, but a widespread, systemic issue. The next few days were a blur of hushed conversations, furtive movements, and growing paranoia. Silas, with his encyclopedic knowledge of the local terrain, guided us to various points along the creek, to neglected drainage ditches, to the edges of the mill property itself. We worked mostly at night, under the cover of darkness, our headlamps casting small, nervous pools of light on the disturbed earth. Ilara, ever the professional, meticulously collected samples: water, soil, even sediment from the creek bed. Each time, her small testing kit, taken back to her lab, yielded the same grim results: elevated pH, heavy metals, toxic compounds. The evidence mounted, a damning indictment of the mill and its complicit enablers. With each new sample, the picture became clearer and far more terrifying. The contamination wasn't localized. It had permeated the very fabric of Cedar Creek. It seeped into the groundwater, flowed into the reservoir, poisoned the soil. It was everywhere. One night, as we were collecting a sample near an old, forgotten culvert on the outskirts of the mill property, a sudden noise made us freeze. A snapping twig, a rustle in the undergrowth. My heart hammered against my ribs. We doused our lights, pressing ourselves against the cold, damp earth. The silence stretched, broken only by the frantic thumping of my own pulse. After what felt like an eternity, Silas, his voice a barely audible whisper, said, "Nothing. Probably just a deer." But his hand, resting on my arm, trembled slightly. We finished quickly, our nerves frayed. A new layer of fear added to our grim determination. We were being watched. Or perhaps we were just paranoid. But the feeling persisted, a prickling sensation on the back of my neck, the sense of unseen eyes tracking our movements. Ilara, despite her scientific detachment, was visibly shaken by the encounter. She doubled down on her security measures at the lab, drawing the blinds, locking every door, and installing a simple motion sensor she had cobbled together. She began encrypting her data, creating backups, ensuring that if anything happened to her, the evidence would still exist. The more we uncovered, the more urgent the need to act became, but also the more dangerous. We were no longer just investigating a local anomaly. We were actively digging into a criminal enterprise with powerful protectors. My thoughts kept returning to the missing people. The young couple who vanished without a trace, the hikers, the old hermit who lived up in the hills. And then there were the strange illnesses, the neurological disorders, the unexplained deaths that had always been attributed to old age or isolated misfortune. It was too much to be a coincidence. The contamination provided a terrifyingly plausible explanation. I remembered the stories Silas had told me, the local legends of the creek, of things that stirred in its depths, of the land itself growing sick. Back then, I had dismissed them as quaint folklore. Now, they took on a chilling new significance. Was the pollution merely a catalyst, awakening something dormant? Or was it simply the mundane, horrific truth behind the legends, a modern monster disguised as corporate negligence? One afternoon, a few days after our culvert scare, I was back at the old library, poring over archived local newspapers. I was looking for patterns. Spikes in illness, reports of strange animal behavior, anything that correlated with Ilara's timeline of relaxed regulations. The dusty pages blurred before my eyes, filled with mundane local news, until a small article from 20 years ago caught my attention. It was a brief mention of a proposed expansion for the mill, and a public meeting where a local farmer, a Mr. Thomas Miller, had vocally opposed it, citing concerns about water quality and potential environmental impact. The article ended with a note that Mr. Miller had mysteriously withdrawn his opposition shortly after the meeting, citing personal reasons. A cold dread washed over me. Thomas Miller. I remembered him. He was one of the missing. Vanished 10 years ago, leaving his farm abandoned, his family distraught. At the time, it had been ruled a simple disappearance. Perhaps he just left town. But now, it seemed far more sinister. He had spoken out. He had raised concerns. And then he was gone. I showed the article to Alara and Silas that evening. Alara's lips thinned into a grim line. Silas's eyes, however, held a flicker of recognition, a deeper understanding. He remembered Thomas. A good man, he said, fiercely independent. He wouldn't have just up and left. Not without a fight. This was it. A direct link between someone who spoke out against the mill and a subsequent disappearance. It wasn't just environmental damage, it was coercion, intimidation, perhaps even murder. The stakes had just been raised exponentially. We needed to find out who was in charge of the mill during that period, who signed off on the relaxed regulations, who benefited. Alara had already begun compiling a list of names from old corporate records she had managed to access through a contact at a regional historical society. The names were mostly local, familiar surnames that held sway in Cedar Creek for generations. The mayor, the head of the town council, the sheriff, prominent businessmen, all interconnected, all part of the same insulated power structure. The more we dug, the more suffocating the web of corruption felt. It wasn't just a few bad apples, it was the entire orchard. The thought of confronting them, of bringing this to light, felt increasingly daunting. We were 3 people against an entrenched system, a system that had already proven its willingness to eliminate obstacles. That night, as I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, my mind replayed the events of the past few weeks. The initial curiosity about the strange occurrences, the vague unease about Cedar Creek, had morphed into a desperate fight for survival, for truth. The mist, the whispers, the feeling of being watched, they all seemed to converge on this central, horrifying truth. Was the pollution merely a cover for something else, something even more ancient and malevolent that the mill had inadvertently awakened? Or was the contamination itself the source of the whispers, the strange visions, the creeping dread that permeated the town? The line between scientific fact and chilling folklore blurred with every new revelation. The next morning, Alara had a new idea. Her contact at the Historical Society had mentioned an old, forgotten archive, a collection of town records from before the mill's major expansion in the 1950s. These records were supposedly held in the basement of the old town hall, a building now used only for storage. She believed there might be original land deeds, environmental assessments, or even early complaints about the mill's operations that had been deliberately buried. It was a risky proposition. Breaking into a municipal building, even an abandoned part, was a serious offense. But the potential reward was immense. If we could find evidence of prior knowledge, of deliberate concealment from the outset, it would blow their entire operation wide open. Silas, surprisingly, was the most enthusiastic. He knew the old town hall well, having worked there briefly as a janitor in his youth. He described a labyrinthine basement, filled with forgotten files and dusty relics. He also mentioned a back entrance, a service tunnel for deliveries that was rarely used and likely unsecured. We decided to go in that night. The tension was palpable. This wasn't just collecting samples anymore. This was a direct confrontation with the heart of their cover-up. As dusk settled, painting the